Hello everyone, it is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCG live codes, make sure you check out the Potown store. You can get a 5% discount on your orders using that code OmniPoke. For today's video, myself and Jack are going to be talking about the new Shrouded Fable expansion. It is only a mini set, but there are still some really impactful cards coming out just in time for the World Championships. The cards are released on the 2nd of August and are legal for exactly Worlds, so just in time, which means we are going to have a bit of a freshen up, even though there are just a handful of cards that have massive impact, and today we're going to be going over all of those.
And as always, we have the OmniPoke rating system as well as the community ratings. Thank you once again for everyone who submitted their ratings. We appreciate it as always. It's always interesting to see how we compare to the community. But yeah, without further ado, we're going to jump into the trainers and some ace specs to start with. The first is Dangerous Laser. It's an item card that puts your opponent's active Pokemon confused and burned. So it's essentially just a double special condition. Overall, it's just not really that impactful. It's essentially a plus 20 when we already have maximum belt. Whilst that does only affect EXs, it's just a much more impactful card. Special conditions aren't really a big thing right now. There's lots of ways to switch out and stuff like that. So for an ace spec, it's really underpowered, I think. Similarly, Poker Vital A heals 150 damage from one of your Pokemon. And you can't actually reuse this card. It can't be put back into your deck or hand. So it really is a one-time use card. And again, we have a similar ace spec that does much better, Scoop Up Cyclone, whilst again, being a bit more of a reset than a Poker Vital, fully heals your Pokemon. You can use coming into play abilities. You can even get rid of things like 2 prizes that you don't want on your board anymore. So in general, yeah, we have 2 ace specs here that are just outclassed by ace specs we already have.
We have the final ace spec, which is Neutral Center. This one's actually a stadium card, and it says prevent all damage done to Pokemon that don't have rule boxes by attacks from your opponent's Pokemon EX and Pokemon V. And once again, if this card is in the discard pile, it can't be put back into your deck or hand. So it's a one-time use deal. The idea being that you can transform some of these more frustrating and useful attacking Pokemon or ability-based Pokemon and essentially turn them into their own version of a Mimikyu in the late game. The only thing about this is that, of course, there are tons of stadium bounces in format, so I think timing the neutral center is going to be the most critical thing here, making sure that either you're using like a Great Tusk and milling cards from the opponent and you sort of scout their discard pile and know that they've already lost 2 or 3 stadium cards, and then this can be the final card that you put into play and hope that it works, cross your fingers that they don't have enough Mimikyu outs, or something like a Luxray where you're fang sniping and cherry picking their answer cards, and then you transition away from Luxray, be it from like pennying it up or if it is eventually KO'd, and then your sort of last chance saloon can be, here's my neutral center, I think I've run you out of resources, and then I have some of these bulkier, more annoying basic Pokemon. A Snorlax that is also a Mimikyu seems like a real headache, and again, Great Tusk, if you've just been given an extra turn or 2, even if the opponent does have answer Pokemon, again, you could have milled them, or if they just don't have a high enough damage cap, because Great Tusk can, be accompanied by tool cards as well, and be quite bulky, it can be difficult for single prizes to one-hit KO these Pokemon with the neutral center established. Maybe that's just enough time for things to come together. Naturally, we think there's already great ace specs that controlling archetypes could look towards, with the Survival Brace and with the Hero's Cape, and for Great Tusk, that's kind of a low-tier archetype, and it actually gets much worse into Charizard, which was previously one of its bigger boasts, but the fact that Dusknoir comes into Charizard decks, they actually can now push into Great Tusk a lot easier by feeding you a prize card and increasing their own damage output. So even though Tusk gains a cool tool, it gets worse into the matchup it used to try and hit. So it doesn't feel like there's many great tomes for this card, although it could synergize nicely with these sorts of strategies.
Onto Nightly Stretcher, a fantastic new item card that puts a Pokemon or a basic energy card from your discard pile into your hand. It's essentially the one side of the old Rescue Stretcher card, but can also get energy back, which is just brilliant. I think decks that currently play 2 Super Rod are going to very easily sort of change that up and go for 1 Nightly Stretcher and 1 Super Rod, just because it gives you options to shuffle things back into the deck, but also immediate access to certain pieces. I think a lot of the Stage 1 and Stage 2 archetypes are really going to like this, to be honest. Being able to pick out your Stage 2 that your opponent's just tried to gust and KO, or be able to get back an attacker, is going to be really important to keep things consistent, especially in those stage 2 decks, which sometimes do have consistency issues. Also, being able to shoot a card like this out and immediately get the card back from your discard is going to be really powerful. You can see a whole array of different archetypes that might like to play this, but honestly, this isn't even the only ones. I think this is very justifiable in pretty much every deck that's around right now. Super Rod is already a very good card, but having another fantastic recovery card is going to be really good. Yeah, like I say, the stage 2 decks are going to really like it for getting back combo pieces, particularly things like Teal Mask, Ogerpon. It's going to be great for being able to get back energy cards, carry on drawing cards, or just getting some more energy for Raging Bolt to be able to, blow up another attacker. I think there will be decks that may still play double Super Rod and a Nightly Stretcher. Chien Pao often played 3 Super Rods, so could still be a 2-in-1 sort of situation. But yeah, very versatile, immediate recovery compared to Super Rod.
Onto our first tool card, we have the Binding Mochi. The attacks of the poison Pokemon this card is attached to do 40 more damage to your opponent's active Pokemon. That is a huge increase in damage output, and it could be a great way that we could improve our reach with certain archetypes that don't quite get there at the moment. As you can see, we have the Pecharunt EX as well as the Janine Secret Technique. Both of these synergize with Darkness Pokemon and can poison them for you. So immediately those sorts of strategies now have damage mod. But also there's Brute Bonnet, which could be a universal means of poisoning. So having this tool just as a buff, as we know, Arven engines are still very powerful. So having this huge damage mod that now could even replace like Maximum Belt as an A-Spec and then free up that slot for other archetypes, it's a pretty interesting concept. As for the archetypes we can think about for this, Okidogi can push its Crazy Chain from 260 up to 300, and this could go even further if you're using the Brute Bonnet package. For example, if you had Sneasler Brute Bonnet and your opponent's active is poisoned, that can actually push the Crazy Chain plus Poison Tick into 330 damage output. Charizard EX has often had Defiance Band in the list as well as Maximum Belt at times, so having Binding Mochi plus Pecharunt could be a combo. The Pecharunt is a nice way to get around Block Lax, for example, so you're covering matchups whilst also having a new damage mod tool. Also, Clorf might just be more reliable as a beat stick into basic EX Pokemon now, not just going to be hitting for weakness into lightning types. Your Unhinged Scissors is the 170 damage output if you have a double Turbo Energy attached, but with Binding Mochi it goes up to 210, and again, if you're using the Brute Bonnet and if you're using Radiant Sneasler, that means you can actually hit 240 with a Clorf now with the Mochi incorporated, so it becomes much more dangerous as a single prize beat stick.
Onto the supporters, and the first is Colress's Tenacity. It searches your deck for a Stadium card and an Energy card and puts them into the hand. Very key wording here. An Energy card means it can search out Special Energy, and that's one really, really important thing because we don't have great ways of searching Special Energy right now, and there's some very powerful ones in format. Neo Upper Energy, we've already mentioned today, being in Dragapult, could be a fantastic card for that archetype. It's already playing a lot of tutor cards, but being able to find Neo Upper is just going to be another brilliant way of being able to activate Phantom Dive early. Double Turbo Energy as well. There's plenty of attackers that want to use Double Turbo. We've just mentioned Clorf. There's a few cards that support the archetype, to be honest, so this could be another one. But also being able to search out a Stadium is really key. We've already seen Arven searching out tools leading to Forest Sealstone, leading to basically tutoring anything. Similarly, you could tutor out Town Store with Tenacity and then find the Forest Sealstone and do it that way. So a lot of flexibility with this one. I feel like this is a card that could see homes in a lot of different archetypes. Any deck that already plays Special Energy is definitely going to be looking to see whether there's some Stadiums they can also weave in and potentially have a really powerful tutor for two very key and difficult to find pieces of the puzzle. Basically, it's one of these cards that I think just gets better over time. The more Stadiums we have, the more Special Energy cards we have. It's going to be, I think it's going to find a home in a lot of different archetypes.
Next up, we have the Janine Secret Technique. You choose up to 2 of your Darkness Pokemon. For each of those Pokemon, search your deck for a basic Darkness Energy and attach it to that Pokemon, then shuffle your deck. And if you did attach an energy to your active Pokemon in this way, they are also poisoned. And as we just mentioned with the Binding Mochi, poison can sometimes be an upside, especially for Okidogi, which is already looking to poison itself anyway. So it's really trying to feed us this package all in this set. With the Loyal 3 and Pecharunt, the Janine is meant to be the acceleration option for that style of archetype. Now, we're still giving it like low rating because I think really the deck still wants to play a lot of drawing cards, but the Janine could be that sort of 2 count, I think, within the deck list to give you that little bit of extra help alongside those dark patches. Comparing it to something like a Sada, it is significantly weaker because you don't have any of that draw power. So we think overall Okidogi is probably going to perform a little bit worse than Roaring Moon does right now. But there are some situations where the Okidogi deck could come out on top and has some unique attributes that goes alongside it. And there also is a Crobat in the set which synergizes with the Janine as well. It's a stage 2, but once you've used that Janine Secret Technique, you can draw until you have 8 cards in your hand. That's a substantial amount of card draw that you can gain, and it's a nice free retreat pivot, which is already good in these Darkness style decks because you want to be using Dark Patch as well to power up these attackers. The main issue being it's hard to juggle a stage 2 line as well as using a supporter like this, which doesn't draw you cards inherently, so it's not quite perfect in terms of the synergies between the two here.
On to 06 Machinations. This is a supporter card that says your opponent discards cards from their hand until they have 3 cards left. Very powerful effect. I think we've seen a lot of sort of interest behind effects like these. We obviously have hand trimmer and all of these kinds of effects. I think often panic people. We still think this is going to be a 2-star card because realistically, it probably only goes into these controlling style archetypes. A lot of the time, whilst it is actually very powerful against those archetypes, there's other things you can be doing. Gusting their engine, things like that. So a lot of the time, going to be better supporters to use against them. But in those kinds of decks where you're able to tutor out at the right time, you're able to slow the game down and then start to whittle away resources, it could be a very powerful one of. That in combination with Luxray V's Fang Snipe, you could realistically basically get rid of all of the good cards from your opponent's hand, force them into essentially a 2-card hand because they can't necessarily keep the one good trainer they have because Fang Snipe will get rid of it as well. So yeah, very powerful effect. I don't think it's going to be sort of overly dominant. I think it's only going to be the control style decks that play this, but I think it is a nice tool for them to pick up. I don't think it's a guaranteed in, just because we haven't really seen anything from things like hand trimmer and stuff, though admittedly that is obviously a mirrored effect, but definitely could be an optional one of for key moments in the controlling archetypes.
Onto stadiums then, we have the Nighttime Academy. Once during each player's turn, that player may put a card from their hand on top of their deck. So it's like a guru, but in the worst sense, because you're not getting a card back, but you can still do some internal synergies here by having this stadium within your deck. You can protect around Iono from the opponent by stashing certain supporter cards on the top of your deck, or if you have some discard synergies like Professor's Research, you could also protect some crucial item cards or something else like that on top of the deck, then draw straight back into the card. Yes, you're sort of -1ing your own research, but you are not having the awkward and painful discards, which can sometimes come up. And there are some other acceleration options which do synergize with the top of the deck as well. Electric Generator being probably the most predominant one, but also there is still the Kiram VMAX in format as well with the Glaciated World ability. So there are some options here for the Nighttime Academy. The only issue is there's already just like very good stadiums in format right now, so there's already a bit of a tug of war going on, so it's hard for you to sort of keep this maintained throughout the entire game, but also it is just overall quite low impact compared to just having higher copies of cards if you're worried about discarding them with research, or having some recovery pieces and other means. And obviously with Iono, the best way to protect yourself is just draw more cards with some engine Pokemon anyway, and the Academy doesn't really help with those.
Finally, on some bulk trainers, we've got Power Hourglass, a tool that lets you attach a basic energy card to the active Pokemon this is attached to at the end of your turn. Ultimately, it's just a bit too slow. You could potentially have this on something that has an awkward energy cost, but because you have to leave it in the active spot, there's then a turn for your opponent to take a hit or, react to that, so it's not particularly powerful. Similarly with Cassiopeia, you can only use it when it's the last card in your hand. You get to search for 2 cards from your deck and put them into your hand, but it's just so difficult to actually do this. It's not particularly reliable. The best way of doing that, I guess, is Squovit, which you could play, but I think there's better engines out there, and at the end of the day, 2 cards isn't going to be doing too much if you then can't play a supporter on top of that. So it's going to have to be 2 pretty special cards, and I don't think there's any decks that can really sort of build around that and don't need more than just 2 cards a turn with this kind of Squovit engine.
So pause now if you want to see the trainer summary, but we are going to be moving on to the EXs. And first of all, we have the Kingdra EX. It's a stage 2 water type with 310 hit points. Its first attack for 1 water energy is King's Order. Definitely an interesting one. You put up to 3 water Pokemon from your discard pile onto your bench. And yes, that can be even stage 2s or VMAXs or anything like that. So you can actually get a big cheat of Pokemon into play. And I think there are some pretty tempting like engine style Pokemon we could use. We still want to have lots of energy acceleration. That's why you're looking at Baxcalibur, Kyurem, and Origin Form Palkia V-Star right now, because the second attack of Kingdra is Hydro Pump. For 2 colourless energy, you do 50, plus 50 more for each water energy attached to this Pokemon. So ideally, you've used the King's Order, you've got some of these Pokemon established, and then it's about raining these water energy into play, so we can deal a meaningful amount of damage with the Hydro Pump option. I suppose the main upside of trying to have a Kingdra strategy compared to something like Chien-Pao, which could already get Baxcaliburs rolling fairly consistently, is that you just have much more survivability on your Kingdra, and you might represent some more single prize board states in the opening stages. However, if you're having a no tempo turn 2 and still have to jump through some hoops to discard some of these Pokemon to get them back into play with your attack, it's still going to be a lot to ask for. There is a little synergy here with the evolution line of Kingdra because there is a Swim Freely Seadra that we could be using. Possibly you just King's Order, get lots of Seadra into play, and because Finian is a basic Pokemon, you can just load up the Seadras before evolving into your Kingdra. The nice thing about this approach is that you're just getting more of your attackers essentially lined up for future turns, rather than putting engine Pokemon into play that your opponent could just take out with Gusting. Of course, Finneon does come with its own challenges. It's a very vulnerable low hit point Pokemon, and there's a lot of spread damage and snipe pressure in format right now, so this also comes with a few issues.
Onto Revavroom EX. It's a Terra Lightning type Stage 1 2-prize Pokemon. It's got the Accelerating Flash attack for 1 energy, does 20 damage, plus 120 if you move from the bench to the active spot this turn. Quite a sort of subtle attack, but actually really, really efficient. Being 1 energy for 140 is not overly amazing, but it hits some key weaknesses like Lugia and Pidgeot, does the exact breakpoints you need to knock both of those Pokemon out, and obviously they are pretty important in the format, so that's one of the biggest selling points of Revavroom. We obviously have the old Scarlet and Violet Revavroom with the Rumbling Engine ability that has decent sort of draw power to it as well. So this could be a nice sort of one-of attacker in a deck that has that engine, and maybe you can pair it with something like a Scizor or another efficient attacker, maybe some Radiant Charizards, just some low to the ground, very efficient attackers, and try and get something going here. We don't think it's going to be crazy good, but it's just a really, really powerful attack, especially against some of these key Pokemon. We've seen attacks like this similar in the past be very powerful. And again, just because it's low to the ground, it's very easy to set up. Things like Nightly Stretcher, just getting back a piece, it's very easy to have an energy plus a Pokemon in your hand after a knockout, so you hopefully be able to find the extra piece from a card like Nightly Stretcher and just be able to consistently pump out Accelerating Flash turn after turn. It does have an attack speed break as well for 3 energy that is 250, and you discard this Pokemon and all cards attached to it, so you could potentially discard the Revavroom, take a big knockout, and leave your board state with no 2-prize Pokemon, but maybe some Varooms to then evolve up an Accelerating Flash with the Nightly Stretcher on the following turn. So there's a cool little synergy there. We still think it's going to be a crazy strong card, but it's a nice option and maybe another archetype to try and build around. The Revavroom hasn't really seen any play, but is a decent sort of draw engine. So that plus the efficiency of Sizzle and obviously having good typing could be maybe some kind of rogue archetype to target some of these lightning weak Pokemon in the format.
Next up, we have the Okidogi EX itself. We're just rating this a 2-star. I've already mentioned a couple of parts of the card, but it is a 250 hit point Dark type basic. Its first attack is Poison Muscle for 1 colorless. You can search your deck for 2 basic Darkness Energy and attach them to this Pokemon, then shuffle your deck. And if you did, this Pokemon is now poisoned. That actually sets up your second attack, that crazy chain, the 2 Darkness Energy with 1 colorless cost, 130 base, but obviously when he's poisoned, you jump all the way up to 260. That's a pretty reasonable threshold, and there are ways that we can push this even further. The means of poisoning us will be either that Petron EX, or the Janine, or possibly even Brute Bonnet in the deck. The reason I mentioned Brute Bonnet is you can actually use your opponent's poison to improve the numbers here as well. Crazy Chain, that 260. With your Mochi, you can go up to 300, but with a Brute Bonnet and a Radiant Hisuian Sneasler, you can also jump to 330. So at that point, you're dealing with the Charizards, of course, and even Dragapult, so that's really tasty damage for a basic. You are having to jump through a few hoops, get a very specific bench going, and have a number of tools, which is why we're rating this a little bit lower than some of the other very aggressive fast decks in format. It just seems like a little bit more convoluted and clunky than some of the Sada engines that we have, the Raging Bolt as well as the Roaring Moon, and even the Miraidon archetypes that can rely on their generators. The only reason we haven't completely written this off is actually the promo Petrunt that we're getting in the set, because it does set this archetype apart from some of these aggressive beat stick 2-prize builds. The fact that you could potentially initiate a prize race going first because you're not attacking with the Petrunt is one of the things that sets this archetype apart and could make it effectively the most aggressive deck in the game for initiating prize races. From our testing so far, we've been pretty uninspired. It's still a convoluted combo to get that Petrunt rolling. Even with the likes of Carmine and Squawkabilly, you're still asking for a lot. And that package of cards also takes up a substantial amount of space, which might detract from the overall strategy anyway.
Onto Monkey Dory EX, a 210 HP Dark type with a Skip a Beat ability that basically turns us into a 1-prizer from attack damage as long as you have a Petrunt in play. That's quite interesting. It means that you can potentially trade against some 2-prize archetypes whilst also representing a 1-prize Pokemon. 2 damage, admittedly, damage counters do get around this, so keep that in mind. But whilst you have a Petrunt EX, it does at least mean that you're able to potentially trade up in certain situations. Obviously, the big issue is you have to have a Petrunt EX in play, which means you still have a 2-prizer in play, so you're still vulnerable to things like Gust and things like that. We have Dirty Headbutt as the attack, which is 190 damage, and you can't use the attack on the following turn. Again, not overly powerful, but it does at least hit for for weakness on certain things, it hits for weakness on Guardian, it can knock out a Squawkabilly, and when it is sort of a one prize Pokemon itself, it's obviously trading up in those situations. But even archetypes like Gardevoir typically have a lot of one prize attackers, so you're still only actually trading evenly with something like this, and this is the kind of card you would want to use against a Gardevoir because of how the numbers line up. So yeah, overall it's not particularly strong. We also have some brilliant one prize dark types already. We've talked about the Petulant a bit, as well as Morpeko, which has seen play in the past, and I think is still a very viable card if you're looking for a one prize dark type like this that does decent damage and obviously has some inbuilt synergies with like the free retreat and stuff as well. So yeah, there's not really many reasons to play this over some of the one prize dark types we already have. Obviously there's natural synergy with things like Dark Patch and Janine, but none of this is anything new to Monkey Dory compared to some of the one prizes we already have. So yeah, just a bit of a weak one overall, unfortunately.
Onto Pheasantipede EX, a spiritual reprint of Oricorio GX back in the day, which did see a decent amount of play. It's a 2/10 hit point dark type basic with the Take Advantage ability. Once during a turn, if any of your Pokemon were knocked out during your opponent's last turn, you may draw 3 cards. You can't use more than one Take Advantage each turn. However, just having a really nice searchable basic Pokemon that can grant you so many cards and give your deck that little bit extra protection against Iono and Roxanne and other hand disruptors is such a nice feeling to have. This isn't just limited to aggressive archetypes either. Think about Charizard Pidgeot, which loves selecting cards turn by turn. Having these top-ups from Pheasantipede can actually open up substantial extra lines of play for you via that quick search if you just happen to draw into another piece along the way. Oftentimes this is going to save a space in some of the stage 2 archetypes like Charizard, like Dragapult Pidgeots, where you just include the Pheasantipede rather than the Barrel that we've seen as of late. But obviously it will have its home alongside some of these aggressive decks. As we know, with Unfair Stamping the formats, some decks have been a little hesitant to go ahead in the prize race unless you're completely swinging your board states. But with Pheasantipede coming into the mix now, you can much more aggressively go once again with Spit Instantly or go aggressive with some of your basic 2 prize archetypes. Knowing that with the combination of like Pheasantipede and Mew EX both being possible within your list, you should have a decent number of cards to clamber together and bounce back from these disruption supporters. There is the Cruel Arrow attack as well, which is all colourless, but it is 3 for 100 damage. It can go anywhere, but it still is a little bit expensive, so I wouldn't expect it to be much of an attacking threat. I suppose the Lost Box builds and Baxcalibur, in theory, could get this going, so maybe it comes in now and again as a useful attacking option, but for the most part, it's earning its slot thanks to that very powerful ability.
And finally, for the EXs, we are going to talk about Petulant EX. It's a 190 HP dark type. We've talked about it a lot already. It has the Controlling Chains ability, which says once during a turn, you may switch one of your bench dark Pokemon except Petulant EX with your active Pokemon. If you do, your new active Pokemon is now poisoned, and you can only use one of this ability per turn. So you can't consistently move things around, but you can essentially have a free switch for any of your dark types once per turn, which is really not what Snorlax wants to see. It's a fantastic anti-control card. Basically means all of these blocking style strategies immediately get run over, and when there's already a fantastic dark type archetype out there in Charizard EX that typically sometimes struggled with the Snorlax build, this is a very easy include to basically shore up that matchup, which is very, very cool. There's obviously the natural synergy as well. We've talked about a lot of the Ogie Dogie package, and obviously it's a big combo enabler for that deck. And realistically, I think any dark deck going forward will definitely consider Petulant EX. Has the Irritating Burst attack as well for 2 dark energy. It does 60 times the number of prize cards your opponent has taken. So in dark decks, it's actually not a bad late game swing as well. If your opponent's taken 4 or even 5 prize cards, you can maybe try and close out the game. And given it's 2 energy rather than 3, that'll be really helpful in certain situations, especially when comparing it to things like Roaring Moon, Ogie Dogie, which need 3 energy to attack. It was only getting the 3-star rating because we think Charizard EX decks aren't going to be able to play this and Dusknoir, which we will talk about later. It's going to be kind of one or the other based on how tight these lists are already, and we feel that this is the slightly inferior build, and that's why Petulant doesn't quite make it to that 4-star and just sits at the 3-star category for us.
So there's your summary for the EX Pokemon. Let's move on to the single prizes. And we start off with the Dartrix. It has a United Wings attack, which we haven't seen for a while. And it's just 1 colourless. You do 20 for each of your Pokemon in the discard pile that has the United Wings attack. That means that we now have 16 potential Pokemon we can throw in the bin that have the same attack. And because there is Ditto in format, we can reach up to 320 damage outputs if we are just attaching a basic Darkness Energy, which is no doubt a scary prospect. The other thing to note about Dartrix is, of course, it's a Grass type. Yes, it's a stage 1, but there's nothing stopping us adding in like 2 copies of Rowlet, and then giving ourselves a really easy time into that Charizard. So it doesn't matter that Ditto can't reach, because Dartrix shouldn't have an issue thanks to the crucial weakness you can now boast. In fact, you actually boast a lot of good weakness coverage. The Watchrook is really good into Pidgeot and Lugia. Murkrow is still very handy into the Gardevoir matchup. and now we gain that grass type coverage for Charizard. The reason we're still going to give this archetype quite a low rating is that there is still just so much pressure for these low hit point archetypes. There's Dragapult, there's Regidrago copying Dragapult, there's Lost Zone box engines with Sableye and with Greninja, there's Monkey Dory and Fluttermane in the Gardevoir decks that they can spam over and over again. It feels like there are just so many matchups that are going to be terrible. So it feels like every time you sit down with a United Wings deck, as soon as your opponent flips over the basic, you know whether you've won or lost that matchup. And you really are this dodge and weave archetype hoping to dodge a wide portion of the format to have a great time into the rest. So ultimately you could spike a tournament here or there, but typically you're gonna stumble into some of these more poor matchups and end up on a pretty mediocre record.
Onto Dusclops and Dusknoir, probably the two most talked about cards from the set. They have a very similar ability. They both have the Cursed Bomb ability. Once during a turn, you may put 5 damage counters on one of your opponent's Pokemon. If you place any damage counters on this way, this Pokemon is knocked out. That's Dusclops'. Dusknoir is 13, so obviously a bit of a difference there, but the key thing is you're going to be able to force your opponent to take a prize card, and that's one of the big selling points of this. You might not think initially that seems like a selling point, but it does activate things like Counter Catcher, it does make your Ionos stronger, could even put you into Roxanne range. All of these kinds of effects that we have in the format right now that are very much dependent on how many prize cards your opponent has taken means that you can actually manipulate that on your side now, which is a very, very strong concept. There's been lots of these sort of cards that manipulate or knock themselves out on your turn for your opponent to take a prize card throughout time, and to be honest, they've all been quite powerful. Some have even been banned in the past. So, this kind of effect is definitely not one to ignore. And when you're also placing damage counters and potentially taking a prize yourself at the same time, it's huge. And given that we have ways of being able to get a Dusknoir out with Rare Candy on turn 2, you can actually take multiple prizes potentially on maybe your opponent's only evolving basics and really shut them out the game quite quickly. There's some very powerful things you can do with these Pokemon. Very, very powerful and tempo swinging, sort of board swinging effects, to be honest. For Dusclops, we can definitely see a thin sort of Duskull Dusclops package going into archetypes like Gardevoir and Dragapult, where you already have some damage manipulation built into your deck. You can kind of combine this with extra damage counters or even sniping that the decks already have to potentially take prizes that your opponent may not have been expecting, or again, multiple prizes at once, which is just very powerful. And then in terms of Dusknoir, it actually looks like it's going to be very powerful and most powerful in a Charizard EX deck, because one other thing about your opponent taking extra prizes in Charizard's case is it also boosts the amount of damage Burning Darkness does, and that is really, really strong. It means that you can force your way into taking knockouts that your opponent may not want you to. Obviously, one way of trying to deal with Charizard, or at least hamper its damage, is trying to not take prizes and set up multiple knockouts in one turn. Well, with Dusknoir, you can force your opponent to take a prize, and then all of a sudden Burning Darkness is doing an extra 30, and, again, with an attack that's already as powerful as that, you're typically going to be taking probably 3 prizes in that case, and potentially being able to go from 3 prizes down to 0 prizes in one turn.
And if you thought that was it, no, there's so much more we can do with the Dusclops. If we really want to get crazy and you want to fill your deck with lots of these, we could try and lean heavily into the Hyper Aroma A spec and get a bunch of these established, ideally by like turn 2 or 3, and really try and pop off. Feed your opponent a ton of prizes all in one go, hope that one of these swing supporters like Roxanne or Iono puts them down to a very low hand size, and in doing that combo, you've ideally set up lots of counters across lots of evolving Pokemon, and something like a Regidrago could use a Kyurem as a big finisher, or a Dragapult even just being copied on turn 2, and you could even use Acceleration from Fortress EX if you really want to get wild. I have seen Japanese lists of this, and it can get very funky at times, where you can board wipe the opponent with enough Curse Bomb action. And there's also a very funky and cool build of the Lost Zone deck, where you actually use Lost City and Dusclops KOing itself, that then puts itself into the Lost Zone to give yourself that ramp towards your Lost Mine or towards your Mirage Gate. And again, with those counters being placed all across the board, you could then just do a big mopping up turn with a Sableye, which is so fantastic to think about. Of course, these are combo decks and they could end up just falling flat, but it does just lean into the potential this card offers. As Jack was saying, Dusknoir is very good at helping push Charizard's damage output, but again, it might be worth just having a full 1/1/1 line in a number of these archetypes, because the Curse Bomb having 13 is such a relevant number in format right now. It helps you immediately just get rid of a lot of engine Pokemon, Radiant Greninjas in a ton of decks, Bibarel of course, lots of evolving like stage 1 Pokemon as well. Notably for Charizard, it gets around Mimikyu as well, which is important. And again, thinking about Drago, if it's already using the Dragapult and already has the Kyurem within the list, you could blow up their Manaphy and then board wipe with the Kyurem attack. There are just so many terrifying options that this combination of cards has. It may be highlight reel moment at times, and it's more likely that the Dusclops comes off in a number of situations for that sort of lower impact option. But when you do have the chance to Dustoir, deal with a Bibarrel plus a Countercatcher plus a Hand Disruptor, you can do all sorts of crazy combinations thanks to this card. All the while, you're dictating that prize map, and essentially you're just accelerating the game state for a lot of these archetypes.
Onto Blood Moon Ursaluna, 150 HP basic fighting type with the Rule of Thumb ability. It says once during a turn, when you play this Pokemon from your hand to your bench, you may attach up to 2 basic fighting energy cards from your hand to this Pokemon. So nice energy acceleration, especially when its attack requires 2 fighting energy. Mad Mud Bite deals 100 damage, plus 30 more for each damage counter on your opponent's active Pokemon. So you're typically going to pair this with archetypes that can already put damage counters onto the board. Could be that Frostlass archetype putting counters on with Freezing Shroud, or could even be a Tachyon Bits style Iron Valiant deck that sort of moves around, puts some damage counters on the active, sets up enough to be able to Mad Mud Bite to get a knockout. I think overall it's still quite weak. There's not a huge amount of archetypes that are super weak to fighting right now. I think Iron Hands is probably the biggest one, and I think there's already plenty of ways we have to deal with Iron Hands, and it's a very expensive way of dealing with Iron Hands as well. So it's still not the most efficient, but I think it's it's quite a bulky one prize Pokemon. You could even synergize it with Raging Bolt EX for some immediate energy onto the board to be able to blow it with the Bellowing Thunder attack. It's quite an interesting one. I think it's just not quite good enough, or it's going to be quite an expensive package into a deck like this. And the Frostlass archetype hasn't really done too much outside of, a particularly impressive showing in one of the rounds at NAIC, but it didn't go too far. Similarly, Iron Valiant hasn't really been seen for a few months now, so I don't think it's going into already established archetypes too well, so that's what's going to hold it back from being particularly impactful.
Next up, we have a quick mention for Slitherwing. It's an ancient Pokemon and is a fighting type that has the Iron Buster attack, the main thing we're looking at here. For a fighting and colorless, you deal 20 plus 120 more if there is a future Pokemon in play. So this card is making no secret of the fact that it can punish the Iron Hands as well as Iron Thorns that can be around in archetypes right now. Because it does have that colorless as its attack cost, it's not too much to ask for to put it in a Sada deck or a Mirage Gate build. The main issue being that the ancient decks don't really want to have a ton of switching cards, so you have to proactively find this option and sort of allow the Lightning type to come into the active anyway, before you then sort of respond with a Slitherwing. And for the Lost Zone boxes, trying to fit in another basic Pokemon and just more types of energy isn't going to be as good as just simply having the Blood Moon, which is that sort of catch-all option that can respond on an Iron Hands, provided you have that Mirage Gate anyway.
We've already briefly mentioned the Crobat, but it does have that Shadow Envoy ability that lets you draw up to 8 if you've used the Janine's Secret Technique during your turn. Again, we've already talked about how this could potentially be a decent engine, but ultimately, because you're not having onboard support to be able to, draw out of things like Iona or Roxanne, you still need to find that Janine's to get that draw power. It doesn't really help as a draw engine sort of towards the latter end of the game when your opponent's really going to be disrupting you. So yeah, probably nothing more than a cube card, unfortunately.
Next up, we have the Stage 1 Zoroark, 120 hit point Dart type, and we're looking at that Phantom Jack attack. For 2 colorless, you do 60 times the number of your opponent's Pokemon EX and V in play. There are a lot of sort of go wide EX builds right now. Look at Raging Bolt Ogerpon, possibly if the Okidogi deck, or even if the Roaring Moon deck is doing well, and Miraidon. The issue with a card like this is that yes, it can do decently well into some matchups, but there aren't really any of these like quad DTE base decks going around right now that can't handle these basic aggressive archetypes. United Wings and Clorf would quite happily deal with any of these lower hit point Pokemon. And if we're looking towards the evolution decks in format, they just don't really have the space to play a Zoroark anyway. So unfortunately, there's just no home for a card like this right now.
Onto Yveltal, which has the Gnawing Winds attack, which puts 2 damage counters on each of your opponent's Pokemon that has any damage counters already on it. Obviously, a natural for this card would be in the Munkidori Frostlass archetype, which again, I've already mentioned once. It's not an archetype that's doing particularly well, and I don't know that you're always going to have those spare energy attachments to be able to weave in Yveltal attacking as well. I think it actually is just one of these cards that naturally just makes your good matchups better, but doesn't really help your worst matchups, and that's why it's not really going to be progressing the archetype up through the tiers too much. I think it could potentially still just be like a natural upgrade, or 1 or 2 of in the deck, but I don't think it necessarily solves some of the fundamental issues, and because of that, it's not going to make it too much better, and it's going to keep it at that 2-star rating.
Next up, we have Pecharunt. Now, this is a promo, but we have mentioned it a little bit already. It's a basic 80 hit point Dart type, and it has the Toxic Subjugation ability. As long as this Pokemon is in the active spot, put 5 more damage counters on your opponent's poisoned Pokemon during Pokemon Checkup. It also has the Poison Chain attack for dark and colorless. You deal 10, and your opponent's active is now poisoned. So it can be a self-enabler if you want to commit 2 energy to it, but I'm actually most interested in this card as a 0 energy option. With the combination of Brute Bonnet and Radiant Hisuian Sneasler, during Pokemon Checkup, that could be 8 damage counters placed on your opponent's active, covering a bunch of evolving basic Pokemon as well as some of the engine Pokemon like Comfey. The fact that this is an ability, not an attack, means although it can be a convoluted combo, it could be reasonable on turn 1 to start initiating that prize race, whilst at the same time saving your energy attachments for other attackers in the back. As for decks this could go into, there are a handful that already like poison-based engines and can already take advantage of some of these combinations. Clorf is limited to 4 energy. Having Petron as this option that can deal low amounts of damage for 0 energy is really appealing. Similar story for the Conkeldurr, it's essentially just a stage 2 version of the Clorf, but that entire deck could play 0 energy, which could be a fun option. And then there are some of these aggressive multi-prize basic decks like Okidogi and Roaring Moon, definitely would appreciate having extra manual attachments onto their basics as you go, all the while still pressurizing prizes with a 1 prizer in the active.
Next up is Genesect with the Ace Nullifier ability. It says if this Pokemon has a Pokemon tool attached, your opponent can't play any Ace Spec cards from their hand. Whilst Ace Spec cards are incredibly impactful, they're some of the best cards we've ever seen, ultimately it's going to be taking up a board space, having to find a tool, and your opponent then has to not have some kind of way of discarding the tool, i.e. Lost Vacuum or something like that, just to be able to get around the ability. The attack is not worth talking about. There's certain archetypes that can still actually get around this, things like Archeops tutoring out Legacy Energy. So overall, whilst cards like this have seen play in the past, we just don't think it's going to be powerful enough, and there's too many decks playing Lost Vacuum that can just get around the ability right now.
Onto the Dragon types, and we have Haxorus. It's a stage 2 Pokemon, so we're never going to think about getting it into play the normal way, but as an Apex Dragon option, it might be worth considering. The Axe Down for 1 fighting energy can knock out your opponent's active that has any special energy attached. That would be really handy into the Lugia matchup, were it not for Miss Energy oftentimes being one of the specials that are equipped onto lots of these Pokemon within the list. And Regidrago is a combo deck right now that is yearning for space, and I don't think Haxorus ever makes the cut.
And finally, onto Kyurem. Kyurem has the Anti-Plasma ability that says if your opponent has a card with Colress in its name in their discard pile, the attack cost of this Pokemon's Triforce attack is 1 colorless instead. Triforce discards all energy attached to this Pokemon, and then you deal 110 damage to 3 of your opponent's Pokemon. So right now, there's a very, very good archetype in the format that plays cards with Colress in Colress's Experiment in these Lost Zone box archetypes. Now, obviously, this is a fantastic counter to those kinds of strategies. Dealing 110 mops up all of the Cramorants, all of the Comfeys, all of the Sableyes. It's just a very, very big swing. But this could also be very powerful against any decks that try and use the new Colress's Tenacity card to tutor out key pieces of their strategy. They could get caught in the crossfire of naturally playing just a Colress card in their deck. As I mentioned, it can very easily clean up a lot of the 1 prize Pokemon from the Lost Zone decks, but it also can be very powerful in a Regidrago deck, taking out multiple evolving basics that your opponent might have in play. Think Pidgeys, think Charmanders, think Roltzes, all of these kinds of things can potentially be knocked out by Regidrago, and obviously Regidrago only needs 3 energy. You're kind of ignoring the Anti-Plasma part of this card, but you're just using the Triforce attack and discarding 3 energy in a deck that already has decent energy acceleration, and the way it's built has a lot of ways of being able to set up a Regidrago quite fast. It means that you can really push your opponent out of the game quite quickly. That's actually where I think the card is going to see more play. I don't think it's going to be as splashed as some people may think, but I think Regidrago is definitely a really powerful archetype and has to be respected, especially with this new Kyurem tool in its arsenal.
And that's it. That's our non-rule boxers. Actually, looks like the star of the show might be Dusknoir, to be honest. You saw we committed a lot of time to it. I've actually done an entire video talking about Dusknoir on its own. I've also done the same thing for Petrarch because it is kind of unique, even though we don't think it's that powerful. Even though Shrouded Fable is a holiday set, it seems like there are a lot of cards to consider going into the World Championships, so should be a really interesting one. We've started to playtest at this point a little bit, and on the channel very soon you're going to start seeing some of those battle videos. So make sure you stay tuned for that if you're looking for some Worlds content. But for now, thanks so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed today's video, and we'll be back tomorrow for another one. Cheers.